The salvage probe had already drilled 3 meters into the dead hull before the lead archivist of the Sehlu conclave understood that the wreck was not dead at all, and by then, the drill had touched something that did not want to be touched. Archivist Prime Oresh watched the readout climb on the survey ring's main display and felt the old cold settle into the joints of his long hands, the cold that came when the universe was about to correct an assumption he had held for too long. The wreck had hung in the drifting dark for 8,000 years. Every catalog the conclave possessed listed it as inert. Oresh had built half of those catalogs himself. "Stop the drill," he said. The survey crew did not stop the drill, because the order had to travel through 3 relays and a translation matrix, and in the half-second it took, the thing inside the hull finished waking up. The readout did not climb anymore. It simply went to a value the display had no room to show, and then the display showed nothing, because the survey ring's power had been taken away from it, gently, the way an adult takes a sharp tool from a child. The Sehlu were an old species. They were, by their own long reckoning, the oldest thinking species in this arm of the galaxy, and they had earned the name the younger races gave them, the Old Ones, the Patient Ones, the ones who had watched empires rise and catalog themselves into dust. The Sehlu did not rush. They did not conquer. They surveyed and recorded and outlasted, and when a thing was finally understood, it was added to the great archive that was the conclave's only god. The wreck in the drifting dark had been a problem in that archive for 8,000 years, an entry marked unknown origin, unknown purpose, inert, and Oresh had finally been granted the resources to close the entry. He had wanted, more than anything in his long, careful life, to close the entry. "Power to the ring is not responding," said the survey technician, a young Sehlu named Vale, whose career was about to become either very short or very strange. "Archivist Prime, the wreck has reached into our systems. It is reading us. It is reading us the way we tried to read it." Vale's report on the grip was precise, the way a frightened scholar's report is always precise. Because precision is the only handhold a scholar has when everything else gives way. The thing in the hull had not seized their power and crushed it. It had not overloaded their relays or burned out their matrices, which were the things a weapon would have done. Instead, it had taken hold of every system aboard the survey ring, with a touch so exact that nothing was damaged at all, the reactor still running, the air still cycling, the lights still on, every instrument intact and functioning, simply no longer answering to Sehlu hands. "It was the difference," Vale said, his voice climbing, "between a thief who breaks the lock and a thief who already has the key. The first one you can hear coming. The second one is already inside, before you know the door was ever a door. And the thing in the hull had the key to every system the Sehlu possessed, had perhaps always had it, had been holding the key in patient reserve for 8,000 years, while the conclave wrote inert in its catalogs and slept soundly on the lie." Oresh listened, and he understood the deeper horror under the surface horror. The one Vale was too young to name. It was not that the wreck was stronger than they had thought. The conclave had met strong things before. It was that the wreck had let itself be measured wrong, deliberately, completely, for 8,000 years, and the conclave had never once suspected, because the conclave's whole method, the method that had made the Old Ones the keepers of the galaxy's memory, rested on a single faith, that a thing measured carefully enough is a thing known truly. The wreck had broken that faith without ever firing a shot. It had simply been patient enough and clever enough to be measured exactly as it wished to be measured, and the Old Ones had recorded the measurement and called it knowledge, and the gap between the measurement and the truth had been 19 kilometers wide and 8,000 years deep, and they had never seen it, because they had been looking at their instruments instead of through them. Oresh held very still. The instinct of his species in the presence of the unknown was stillness, and 8,000 years of inertness had taught the whole conclave to think of this particular unknown as safe. He had brought a survey ring of 400 Sehlu, a research vessel, 2 tenders, and no weapons at all, because the wreck was inert, because the catalog said so, because he had written it. He understood now that he had made the single largest error of a career, built on never making errors. And the error had a shape, and the shape was 8,000 years long. He had argued for this expedition for 30 years. 30 years of petitions to the conclave's resource committees, 30 years of being told that an inert wreck in the emptiest dark in the galaxy was the lowest of priorities, that the resources of the old ones were better spent on living mysteries than on a cold entry that had not changed in 80 centuries. And Oresh had persisted because the entry galled him, because an unknown was an unknown no matter how old and how cold, and because he believed, with the deep stubborn faith of a record keeper, that no entry should be allowed to stand unfinished forever. He had finally won the argument. He had finally been given the ring and the vessel and the tenders, and his reward for 30 years of persistence was to discover, in the space of a single drilled hole, that the entry had not been unfinished. It had been hiding. "Show me the hull," he said. "Optical. All of it. I want to see what we woke." The optical came up, and the survey crew of 400 Sehelu looked, for the first time in 8,000 years, at a thing that was no longer pretending to be dead. The wreck had been a long, broken shape on every survey since the founding of Oresh's branch of the archive, a hull split and gutted and gone cold, drifting end over slow end through the empty reach between two starless voids. That was the lie it had told. Now lights were coming up along its length, not many, not bright, just a line of deep red points blinking awake down a hull that the survey had always measured as 4 kilometers long, and which now, with the lights on, the survey measured as 19. Vale's hands had stopped working. "The length changed," he said. "Archivist Prime, the length changed. It was 4 kilometers. It is 19 kilometers. The wreck is unfolding." It was not unfolding. Oresh understood that, in the cold place where his species kept the truths it did not want. It had never been 4 kilometers. It had let itself be measured at 4 kilometers for 8,000 years, because a thing that wishes to be left alone makes itself small in the catalog, and the Selu, who trusted the catalog above their own eyes, had recorded the small number and moved on. The wreck had hidden inside their own faith in their own records. Of all the species in the galaxy, the old ones were the easiest to hide from, because the old ones believed that anything written down was finished. "Archivist Prime," said Vale, and his voice had climbed into a register the translation matrix struggled with. "It is broadcasting, on every band at once. It is not a signal. It is a single word, repeated. The matrix is translating it. Do you want it?" "Give it to me," Oresh said. The matrix translated the word, and it put the word on the dead display in the old written form of Oresh's own tongue, and the 400 Sehlu of the survey ring read it together in the silence of the drifting dark. The word was a name. It was not a Sehlu name. It belonged to the species that had built the wreck, the species the Conclave had spent 8,000 years failing to identify, a species whose home star the archive had never found, and whose existence the archive had quietly concluded must have ended long ago. The word, repeated on every band, the first word the wreck had spoken since before the Sehlu learned to write, was this: endurance. Oresh did not know yet that it was not a description. He did not know yet that it was the ship's name. He only knew, looking at the 19 kilometers of waking red light where 4 kilometers of safe dead metal should have been, that the oldest species in the galaxy had just made a mistake that the rest of the galaxy was older than, and that the mistake was now awake, and reading them, and saying its name into the dark as if remembering it for the first time in 8,000 years. "Pull the ring back," Oresh said. "All 400. Now. Quietly. We woke it by accident. Perhaps it will let us leave the way one steps back from a sleeping predator." "Archivist Prime. The tenders will not answer," Vale said. "The research vessel will not answer. Helm is locked. We are not steering. Something else is steering." Oresh moved to the helm station himself, his long hands finding the manual override that no Sehelu in living memory had needed to use. And the override did nothing, because the wreck held it the way it held everything else aboard the survey ring, with a grip so light and so total that it felt less like capture than like correction. The survey ring began, slowly, to turn, not toward escape, toward the wreck. The 19 kilometers of waking red metal grew larger on the optical, and the 400 Sehlu of the Conclave's finest survey crew were drawn toward it across the empty reach, like filings drawn to a stone, and Oresh, who had built half the catalog that called this thing dead, understood that he was about to be added to an archive that was not his own. "Speak to it," Oresh said to Vale. "Open the matrix the other way. If it can read us, we can answer it. Tell it we meant no harm. Tell it we are scholars. Tell it the truth, that we believed it was dead, that we are the species that keeps the records, that we will record whatever it wishes recorded, if it lets the 400 go home." Vale's hands shook so badly that he had to use both of them to open the channel. He spoke into the matrix the careful, formal words of the conclave, the words used for first contact with a thing whose strength is unknown, and the words went out across the closing distance toward the waking hull. For a long moment there was nothing, only the red lights blinking awake one after another down the impossible length of it, and the slow, inexorable turn of the survey ring toward its flank. Then the wreck answered, and it did not use the matrix. It spoke instead inside the heads of all 400 Sehlu at once, without sound, without translation, a voice that had learned their language in the time it took to drill 3 meters into its hull, a voice that was patient in a way that made the Sehlu, who prided themselves on patience above every other virtue, feel like children who had only just discovered the concept. "You believe I was dead," the voice said. "You wrote it down. I have been listening to you write it down for 8,000 years. I let you. It was restful. But you put a drill in me, and a drill is a question, and I have been alone with the answer for a very long time, and I find that I would like to give it to someone before I sleep again. You will do. Come closer. I will not hurt you. I only want to be remembered correctly, and you are, by your own account, the keepers of what is remembered." And the survey ring drew closer, and Oresh, Archivist Prime of the Sehlu Conclave, the keeper of the record, felt the first true dread of his 800-year life, because he understood that he had not woken a weapon. He had woken a witness, and witnesses are far more dangerous, because a weapon only wants to win, and a witness wants to be heard. But the survey ring did not pull back, because the wreck had its power, and its relays, and its translation matrix, and a thing that has been alone for 8,000 years does not, when something finally knocks, simply let it walk away. The survey ring came to rest against the flank of the Endurance, with no impact, held in place by the same light, total grip, and a passage opened in the wreck's hull, where no passage had been on any survey, and the voice in the heads of the 400 Sehlu said, "Send me one, not the young one whose hands shake, the old one who built the lie. He should be the one to learn the truth. It is only fair." Oresh went, because there was no choice in it, and because 800 years of being the keeper of the record had left him with one stubborn pride, which was that a record built on a lie was his to correct, even at the cost of correcting it from the inside. Before he went, he turned to Vale and put one long hand on the young technician's shoulder, the first time in the expedition he had touched anyone, and he told him that whatever happened in the next hours, Vale was to keep the matrix open and keep the recordings running, because if the worst came, the recordings would be the only thing that survived to teach the conclave what it had done. Vale, white to the lips, said that he would. Oresh believed him. The young one's hands shook, but his will did not, and Oresh had learned across 800 years that the two were not the same thing, and that the steadiest people were very often the ones whose hands shook the worst. He walked the opened passage alone, his long Sehlu frame moving through corridors built for a body shaped differently than his own. And the dread he carried was not the dread of death. It was the older, deeper dread of a scholar who was about to discover that everything he wrote was wrong. The corridors of the Endurance were not the corridors of a wreck. That was the second lie undone. For 8,000 years the surveys had shown a gutted hull, split open, cold and broken, and the surveys had been correct about the outer kilometers, the dead skin the ship wore on purpose. But deep inside, past the cold and the dark and the deliberate ruin, the Endurance was whole. Its corridors were lit with a soft, steady, living light. Its air was warm. Its surfaces were worn smooth not by abandonment, but by use, the use of hands over a very long time, and Oresh understood that the ship had not been drifting empty through the drifting dark. It had been drifting occupied. "You begin to understand," the voice said, and now it came from the air around him, gentler than it had been in his head. "I was not a wreck. I was hiding. There is a difference, and your archive never learned it, because your archive believes a thing is what it is measured to be, and I am very good at being measured wrong." "Why hide?" Oresh said, walking. His voice did not shake. He was proud of that. 8,000 years. From what? From whom? The conclave found nothing in this reach to hide from. It is the emptiest region in the arm. That is why we left you so long. There was nothing out here to threaten you, and nothing out here to interest us. You are wrong twice in one breath, the voice said, almost fondly. There was nothing out here because I made it nothing. And you were interested. You were interested for 8,000 years. You simply mistook your interest for completeness. Keep walking. There is someone you should meet, and he has waited longer than you have lived to meet anyone at all. The corridor opened into a chamber, and in the chamber there was a single human, and he was alive. Oresh had never seen a living member of the species that built the Endurance, because the archive had concluded the species was extinct, because no living member had ever been found, because the one living member had been here, in this chamber, in this reach, the whole time. The human was old. That was the first thing Oresh's careful eye recorded. Old in a way that went past the ordinary aging of a short-lived species into something the Sehlu did not have a word for. A man whose years had stopped being counted and started being endured. He sat in a worn chair before a worn console, and he turned when Oresh entered, and his eyes were clear and tired and very, very patient. More patient than any Seflu's, and Oresh felt the dread deepen, because patience was supposed to belong to the old ones, and here it was, wearing a human face. You're the one who drilled into my ship, the old man said. His voice was rough with disuse and steady with command. 8,000 years, and you're the first one to actually touch the hull. The others always just measured and moved on. I'd started to think nobody out here ever would. He studied Oresh with the unhurried attention of a man who has all the time there is. You look like a record keeper. The careful kind. That's good. The careful kind is who I've been waiting for. You are alive, Oresh said. Your species is extinct. The archive is certain of it. My species is fine, the old man said. My species is doing extremely well, several thousand light years from here, and has been for a long time. I'm not extinct. I'm a garrison. There's a difference, and your archive never learned it. He almost smiled at the echo of his own ship's words. Sit down, record keeper. My name is Captain Idris Vane, and I have been holding this position for 8,040 years, and you and your 400 friends have just become the first people I get to explain it to. So let me explain it properly, because I have had a very long time to get the explanation right. Oresh sat. There was nothing else to do, and besides, he was a scholar, and a scholar in the presence of a witness he had wrongly catalogued as extinct does not flee. He listens. He took the recording instruments from his survey harness and set them out with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and Captain Idris Vane watched him do it with something that might have been approval. Good, Vane said. Record it. That's the whole point. 8,000 years I've been the entry in your archive that says inert, unknown, dead. I want that entry corrected, and I want it corrected by the species that takes records seriously, which is you. So write this down. 8,040 years ago, my people fought a war out here. Not against your conclave. You weren't anyone yet. Against something older than you. Something that came from one of the starless voids your surveys won't go into, because there's nothing out there to catalog. There was something out there. We met it. We beat it, mostly. And then we did the thing my species does that nobody ever expects, which is that instead of going home and celebrating, we left a guard. A guard? Oresh said. One ship, one man, for 8,000 years. One ship, one man, for as long as it takes. Vane leaned forward, and the patience in his old eyes hardened into something Oresh recognized, because it was the same thing that lived in the deep records of his own species, the thing that outlasts empires. The thing we beat wasn't dead, it was sleeping, the same way your archive thought I was sleeping. You don't beat a thing like that and then walk away. Because it's patient, and you're not, and patience always wins the long game. So we didn't walk away. We left the Endurance to watch the door it might come back through, and we left someone aboard to make the decision a machine shouldn't make alone, and that someone is me, and I have been awake for the worst of it and asleep for the rest, watching one spot in the dark for 80 centuries, and in all that time the only thing that has ever knocked on my hull is your drill. The chamber was very quiet, far away. Through 19 kilometers of waking ship, Oresh could feel the 400 Sehlu of his survey ring held in the Endurance's gentle grip, and he understood that their fate had just become tangled with a war 8,000 years old, that no one in the conclave had ever known was fought. There was a thing in the chamber that Oresh's scholar's eye kept returning to. A small thing, easy to miss. And it was the thing that finally convinced him past all argument that Captain Idris Vane was exactly what he claimed to be. Beside the worn console, there was a wall, and on the wall, there were marks. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, cut into the metal in long, even rows, and Oresh understood after a moment that they were a tally, a man counting time. Not the ship's clock, which would have kept the count without him, but a thing made by a hand, scored into the wall day after day for the comfort of the scoring, the way a prisoner counts the days not because he needs the number, but because the counting is a thing to do, a proof to himself each day that he was still there, still keeping, still real. The rows began crisp and careful near the top of the wall, the marks of a man who still believed the count would matter to someone, and they grew, lower down, into something rougher and more uneven, the marks of a man who had stopped believing anyone would ever read them, and went on cutting them anyway. And then, near the bottom, where 8,000 years of marks had nearly filled the wall, they steadied again into something calm and even, the marks of a man who had made his peace with counting for no one but himself. Oresh looked at the wall of marks, 8,000 years of a single hand, keeping time alone in the dark, and he did not need any further proof. No lie could have made that wall. No deception arranges tens of thousands of hand-cut marks in the changing rhythms of a real despair, and a real endurance, and a real peace. The wall was a record, the truest kind, kept by the one method older than any archive, and Oresh, the keeper of records, recognized a record when he saw one. He took an image of the wall, carefully, every row, because it belonged in the corrected entry more than anything else in the chamber, and Vane watched him do it, and said nothing, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that some things do not need to be explained, only kept. He looked at the old man for a long moment, taking the measure of him the way a scholar takes the measure of a primary source, weighing it for truth. Everything in the chamber confirmed the story. The wear on the chair was the wear of a single body over an impossible span of time. The console was worn in the exact places a man's hands would wear it if he sat at it, alone, for 80 centuries. There were no other quarters in the chamber, no sign of any second occupant, no graves, because there had never been anyone to bury. The Endurance had carried exactly one living soul through 8,000 years of the emptiest dark in the galaxy, and the soul was sitting in front of Oresh now, telling him the truth, in a voice rough with 80 centuries of disuse. "Why tell me?" Oresh said. "Why not simply let us go, now that you have measured us, and found us harmless? We are scholars. We woke you by accident. We mean nothing to your war." "Because you didn't wake me by accident," Captain Idris Vane said, and for the first time, something like grief crossed his old face. "That's what I have to explain to you next, and it's the part you're not going to want to record. You didn't drill into a sleeping ship. You drilled into a tripwire, and tripwires don't go off for nothing." Oresh set down his recording instrument. "Explain the tripwire," he said, plainly. "I am old for my kind, and I have heard a great many explanations, and the plainest ones are always the ones that turn out to be true." Oresh asked the question that a scholar must always ask, the one that comes before all the others. "How do I know," he said, "that you are telling me the truth? You have already shown me that your ship can be measured wrong for 8,000 years. You have shown me that the thing inside can speak in the voice of my own certainty. How do I know that you, Captain Vane, are not another mask, another careful measurement of yourself, arranged to make me do a thing I would not do if I saw you truly?" Vane did not take offense. If anything, the question seemed to please him, the way a hard question pleases a man who respects the asker. "You don't know," he said. "Not for certain. A careful being never knows for certain. And you're the most careful being I've met in 8,000 years, so I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But here's what I'll give you, record keeper, and you can weigh it however your kind weighs things. The ship could have lied to you the whole way in. It could have shown you a younger man, a stronger man, a man who looked like rescue instead of a man worn down to the bone by 80 centuries of holding. It showed you me, exactly as I am, old and tired and nearly out of time. Because the truth is, the only thing I have left that's worth anything, and I'm not going to spend my first conversation in 8,000 years telling a lie to the one person who might carry the record. The thing inside lies, because lying is all it has. I tell the truth because the truth is all I want. You'll have to decide which of us you're talking to. But ask yourself this, archivist. The lie inside this ship wants you to leave. I want you to stay and help. A liar trying to use you sends you away from the danger, where you can do nothing. Only the truth asks you to walk toward it. Oresh weighed it, the way his kind weighed things, slowly and without flinching, and he found that the reasoning held. The thing inside had told the 400 to flee. The old man was asking them to stay. A deception that wanted to free the sealed thing would clear the survey ring out of the way. Only a truth that wanted the door held would call for more hands at the door. The logic was not proof, but it was the shape of proof, and a scholar learns to act on the shape of proof when proof itself is out of reach. And Oresh had spent 800 years learning exactly that. He inclined his long head, the Sehlu gesture of provisional acceptance, the one that means I will proceed as though this is true, and revise if it is not. And Vane, who somehow knew the gesture, though no human had seen a Sehlu in 8,000 years, inclined his own head back, and the bargain between them was made. The thing we beat 8,000 years ago, Vane said, doesn't move on its own anymore. We saw to that. We broke its ability to act, but we couldn't break its ability to wait, and we couldn't break the one thing it could still do, which is reach. It can still reach into systems, sensors, power grids, translation matrices, drills, anything that touches my hull, it can touch back, the same way my ship touched yours when you drilled. For 8,000 years, nothing touched my hull, so it stayed asleep, and so did I. Then you drilled. And the moment your drill went 3 meters into the Endurance, it didn't just wake me. Vane looked at Oresh steadily. It woke the other thing too, because the other thing is inside my hull. It always has been. That's what a garrison is, record keeper. We didn't leave a ship to watch the door. We are the door. The thing we beat is sealed inside the Endurance, and I have spent 80 centuries being its jailer, and your drill just rang the bell in the cell. Oresh felt the cold reach all the way into the marrow of his long bones. Then you must seal it again. Whatever you did before, do it again, and let us leave, and we will correct the archive. We will mark this reach forbidden. We will see that no probe ever comes here again. I can't seal it again, Vane said, and the grief was full in his voice now. Sealing it took the whole fleet that fought the war, and the fleet went home 8,000 years ago, and it took a price I won't describe to a stranger. I'm one man, and one ship. I can hold the door. I have held the door for 80 centuries. But holding a door that's been rung is different from holding a door that's quiet, and the thing inside is awake now, and it knows the bell was rung from outside, which means it knows there's an outside again, which means for the first time in 8,000 years, it has a reason to push. He stood, slowly, the movements of a man whose body had forgotten how long it had been since it last hurried. So here is the situation, and I'm going to give it to you straight, because you're a record keeper, and you deserve the record. You woke me. You woke it. It is going to try to get out. And the only thing standing between it and the rest of the galaxy, including your 400 friends, and your conclave, and your whole patient, careful species, is one old man, and one ship that everyone in this arm of the galaxy has spent 8,000 years certain was already dead. What do you need? Oresh said, and was distantly amazed to hear himself say it, because the keeper of the record was offering aid to the entry he had come to close. We have no weapons. We are 400 scholars and a survey ring, but we are here, and the thing is here, and I will not sit and record while it pushes through a door. Not when my error is the reason the door was rung. Captain Idris Vane looked at the old Sehlu archivist for a long moment, and something shifted in the worn lines of his face, something that had not moved in 80 centuries, and Oresh realized that he was watching a man who had not been thanked, or offered help, or treated as anything but a dead entry, since before Oresh's species learned to write. That, Vane said quietly, is the first decent thing anyone has said to me in 8,000 years. He turned to his worn console, and his old hands moved across it with a sureness that no amount of solitude had eroded. All right, record keeper. Here's what I need. I need your survey ring's reactor, because mine has been running at a whisper for 80 centuries, and the thing inside is about to make me spend more power in an hour than I've spent in a millennium. I need your 400 scholars, because holding the door takes more hands than I have, and you have 400 more than I do. And I need you, specifically you, the one who keeps the record, to do the one thing my whole species couldn't do 8,000 years ago, which was leave a witness. Because if I lose, somebody has to know what was out here, and why, and that it was held as long as it could be held. Your archive thought it was closing an entry. It's about to open the most important one it will ever keep. And if you do not lose, Oresh said. For the first time, Captain Idris Vane smiled, and it was a tired and terrible, and entirely human thing. If I don't lose, he said, then in a few hours, you and your 400 go home, and you correct the archive, and the entry stops saying inert. And it starts saying the truth, which is that for 8,000 years, one human warship and one human man stood guard over a door in the emptiest dark in the galaxy, asking nothing, expecting nothing, forgotten by everyone, and held it. That's the entry I want. That's the only thing I've wanted for 8,000 years. Now help me ring the bell back. The thing inside the Endurance began to push before they were ready, because patient things do not give their jailers time to prepare, and the first sign of it was not a sound, but a wrongness in the warm living air of the ship, a pressure that had no direction, as if the inside of the hull had begun, very slowly, to disagree with the idea of staying inside. Oresh felt it the way one feels a held breath in another room. Captain Vane felt it the way a man feels an old wound, change in bad weather, and his hands went still on the console for one long moment, before they began to move faster than before. It's testing the seal, Vane said, same as always. But it's testing harder than it's tested in 8,000 years, because it knows the bell rang. Record keeper, get your 400 ready. I'm going to route your reactor into the holding lattice. They won't have to fight. They'll have to hold. The lattice needs minds in it. Willing minds. Anchored. Steady. Your species is the most patient in this arm. You've been telling everyone that for 8,000 years. Now you get to find out if it's true. Oresh opened the matrix to his survey ring and spoke to his 400, and he did not soften it, because they were scholars and they had earned the truth. He told them what they had woken. He told them what stood inside the hull. He told them that there were no weapons, that there would be no battle they would recognize, that what was needed was the one thing the Conclave had always claimed as its highest virtue, which was the willingness to hold steady in the presence of the unknown, for as long as holding steady took. And then he asked them, 400 scholars who had come to close an entry, whether they would help an old human hold a door against a thing older than their species. They said yes, all 400. Not because they were brave, for the Sehlu did not prize bravery, but because they were keepers of the record, and the record had been wrong, and the only way to make it right was to be part of the truth instead of the error. Oresh had never in 800 years been prouder of his careful, patient, cautious people. Vale spoke for them, his voice steadier now than it had been since the drill, and he said that a scholar who would not help correct the largest error in the history of the archive was no scholar at all, and that they were all of them ready, and that they would hold for as long as the old human had held, if it came to that, though Oresh prayed it would not. The holding began. It was nothing Oresh could have described in any of the catalogs he had spent his life building, because it happened in a place the catalogs had no instruments for. The Endurance's holding lattice reached out through the survey ring and gathered the 400 Sehelu minds, the way a hand gathers loose thread, and woven into the lattice they became part of the thing that held the door, and Oresh felt, all at once, the full weight of what Captain Idris Vane had been carrying alone for 8,000 years. It was unbearable. It was a pressure that wanted, with an ancient and bottomless will, to be let out, and it pushed against the lattice, with a patience that made 8,000 years feel like a held breath, and Oresh understood in an instant, of pure cold clarity, that no Sehlu could have held this for a single year, let alone 80 centuries, and that the old man at the console had held it alone, and that he had done it without complaint, and without thanks, and without anyone in the galaxy knowing he was there. The weight of it changed him in that first instant, the way certain experiences change a person past undoing. He had come to the drifting dark, believing himself an old being, 800 years a scholar, patient beyond the reckoning of the younger races, and in the moment, the lattice gave him the true measure of what Vane had carried. He understood that he had never once in 800 years known what patience was. He had merely been slow. There was a difference, and it was the same difference Vane had named, between a thing that is what it appears and a thing that has been measured wrong. Oresh had thought himself patient because he could wait 30 years for a committee to grant an expedition. Vane had waited 8,000 years for the universe to ring a bell that might never ring, holding a door the whole time, and had never let go. And that was not slowness. That was a different and greater thing entirely. And Oresh felt the smallness of his own life against it, the way the Combine's sub-marshal, in another part of the dark Oresh would never know of, had felt the smallness of 40,000 hulls against one ship. "Hold," Vane said, his voice steady across the lattice, reaching all 400 at once. "It's strong. It's always strong. But it can't act on its own anymore. Remember that. It can only push. It can only reach. It can only test. It needs something to act through, and right now the only things it can reach are us. So it's going to try to turn one of us into the thing it acts through. Don't let it in. Don't listen to what it tells you. It's very old and very good at sounding like the thing you already believe." And the thing began to speak, and it spoke to each of the 400 Sehlu in the voice of their own deepest certainty, the certainty that the record is complete, the certainty that a thing measured is a thing finished, the certainty that had let the conclave catalog the endurance as dead for 8,000 years. It told them that the old human was lying, that there was no door, that the wrongness in the air was the human draining their reactor for his own ends, that they should release the lattice and take their survey ring and go home and correct the archive to say the human was a parasite who had captured a survey ring. It was a good lie. It was built from their own faith. And one by one, Oresh felt his scholars begin to waver, because the lie was made of exactly the thing they trusted most. The lie did not give up when Vale stopped wavering. It changed its target, the way a patient thing always changes its target, and it turned the whole of its ancient cleverness on Oresh himself, because Oresh was the keeper of the record, and the keeper of the record was the one whose certainty mattered most. It spoke to him in the voice of his own life's work. It told him that he was old, that he had spent 800 years building an archive on the principle that a thing measured is a thing known, and that if he held this door, he was admitting that the principle was false, that his whole life had been an error, that everything he had ever recorded was suspect, every entry, every catalog, every careful measurement, all of it built on a faith the wreck had just broken. "Let go," the lie whispered in the voice of Oresh's own scholarship. "Let go and flee, and preserve the archive as it is. Because if you stay and help, you will have to rewrite everything, and a being who must rewrite everything has wasted his whole existence, and no being can bear to know he has wasted his whole existence. So let go, save yourself from that unbearable knowing." It was the cruelest thing the lie could have said to him, because it was almost true. Oresh would have to rewrite a great deal. The principle was false, or at least incomplete, and his life's work did rest on it, and there was a grief in that which the lie had found, and pressed with terrible precision. But Oresh had spent 800 years learning the one thing that the lie, for all its age, did not understand about scholars, which is that the love of truth is stronger than the fear of having been wrong. A real scholar does not flee the discovery of his own error, he runs toward it, because the error is itself a truth, the most valuable kind, the kind that corrects all the others. The lie had offered him the chance to preserve a comfortable falsehood. Oresh wanted the uncomfortable fact more than he wanted comfort, had always wanted it more, had built his whole life on wanting it more. And the lie, which thought it was offering him salvation, was offering him the one thing a true keeper of records would never take. He pushed the voice away, not with anger, but with something closer to gratitude, because it had shown him, in the moment it tried to break him, exactly what he was made of. And he held. He felt Vale waver, far down the lattice, the young technician's certainty bending toward the lie the way a young tree bends toward a strong wind, and Oresh understood that the thing had chosen Vale deliberately, the youngest and least certain, the one whose hands shook, the weak point in any chain. The lie poured into Vale the precise shape of his own doubt. He had drilled the hole. He had set off the tripwire. Everything that was about to go wrong was his fault, the lie whispered, unless he ended it now by releasing the lattice and fleeing, and was not fleeing the rational thing, the recorded and catalogued and proper thing, was not a scholar's whole duty to preserve the data and withdraw from danger so the data might survive. The lie wore the mask of Vale's training. It always wore the mask of the thing you trusted. So Oresh did the only thing a keeper of the record could do against a lie built from records. He told them the truth, across the lattice, in the plainest words he had. "It is using our own certainty against us," he said. "The same certainty that wrote the entry that called this ship dead. We were wrong about the ship. We are not going to be wrong twice in one day. The human is not lying. I have looked at his face, and I have looked at his ship, and I have looked at 8,000 years of his solitude, and I am the keeper of the record, and I am telling you that the record we are about to write is this: the endurance held. Now hold with it." And then, more quietly, to Vale alone, across the part of the lattice that only the two of them shared, he said, "The drill was mine, not yours. I gave the order to survey. I argued 30 years for this expedition. If there is a fault, it is the oldest fault in the conclave, and it belongs to me. And the way I am choosing to answer for it is to hold, and I am asking you to hold with me, not as a technician preserving data, but as my friend." And Vale, who had never once been called a friend by the Archivist Prime in all the years of his service, stopped wavering, and held. The 400 held. The thing pushed harder. The pressure in the air became a thing that could be felt in the joints, in the teeth, in the long bones of the Sehlu, and the soft living light of the endurance flickered, and far down the 19 kilometers of the hull, Oresh felt the seal of the door begin, for the first time in 8,000 years, to bend. Captain Idris Vane's old hands flew across the console, rerouting power, anchoring the lattice, doing with the practiced motions of 8,000 years of solitary watch, the work of holding a door that had never before been wrung this hard. And Oresh, woven into the lattice, holding with all the patience his species had ever claimed to possess, understood that they were not going to be enough. 400 scholars, and one old man, and one ship were holding a door against a thing that had been waiting 8,000 years for someone to ring the bell, and the thing had finally been given a reason to push, and the door was bending, and there was nothing else in the emptiest dark in the galaxy to throw against it. He felt the bending in his own body, as if the door were a thing inside himself, rather than 19 kilometers away in the bones of an alien ship. Each push of the ancient will moved the seal a fraction further, and each fraction held for a while, and then yielded the next fraction, the way a wall does not break all at once, but gives ground in small surrenders, until the last of its strength is spent. Oresh counted the surrenders the way he counted everything, precisely, helplessly, a record-keeper recording his own defeat. He thought of the conclave, the whole patient, careful civilization of the old ones, the great archive that was their only god, and he thought of what would reach it if the door gave way. The ancient, bottomless thing that had been sealed out here for 8,000 years, free at last, reaching into a galaxy that believed it had been dead since before the Sehlu learned to write. The conclave had built nothing to stop it. The conclave did not know it existed. The conclave had written it into the archive as a censor fault and moved on, the way it had written everything it could not measure, into the archive as a fault and moved on. And the habit that had made the old ones the keepers of the galaxy's memory had also made them blind to the one thing in the galaxy that most needed remembering. "Captain," Oresh said, across the lattice, and for the first time his own ancient patience failed him. "It is too strong. The door is bending. We are not enough. Tell me what your fleet did 8,000 years ago. Tell me the price you would not describe. Whatever it cost, we will pay it. Because the alternative is that this thing reaches a galaxy that thinks it has been dead for 8,000 years, and has built nothing to stop it." And Captain Idris Vane, who had held the door alone for 80 centuries, stopped working the console, and turned, and looked at the old Sehlu archivist, and said the thing that changed everything. "I don't have to tell you what my fleet did," he said. "I can show you, because the price wasn't a thing we spent. The price was a thing we promised. And 8,000 years ago, when we left me here, we promised that if the door was ever wrung this hard, we would come back. We left a signal buried in the seal itself, a signal that only fires if the door bends this far, and your drill just bent it this far, and the signal fired the moment the thing started to push." He almost smiled, and the smile was the most frightening and most hopeful thing Oresh had ever seen on any face. "Record keeper, you keep asking why I told you to leave a witness if I lose. I told you that because I'm an honest man, and I plan for losing. But I don't think I'm going to lose, because the signal fired 4 hours ago, and my people are very, very fast. And they have spent 8,000 years knowing exactly where this door is, and exactly what's behind it, and exactly what they promised to do if it ever rang. He turned back to the console, and on the worn display, at the far edge of the emptiest dark in the galaxy, the first contact bloomed. It was one ship. Oresh, woven into the lattice, holding the bending door, watched the single new contact cross the edge of the reach, and thought, with the part of his mind that was still a record keeper, that one ship would not be enough, that one ship had never been enough, that whatever the humans had promised 8,000 years ago, a single arriving hull could not turn a door, that 400 Sehlu and a garrison ship were losing. And then the optical resolved the single contact, and Oresh stopped thinking about whether it was enough. The ship was not built like the Endurance. The Endurance was old, weathered, 8,000 years of solitary watch worn into every surface. The thing that crossed the edge of the reach was new, and it was clean, and it was enormous, in a way that made the 19 kilometers of the Endurance look like a lifeboat, and it moved with a speed that the Sehlu instruments, even drained and half-blind, recorded and then refused to believe, and then recorded again. It crossed the emptiest dark in the galaxy, a distance the Conclave's fastest courier would have needed a year to span, in the time it took the bending door to bend a little further, and it did not slow as it came, and it did not pose, and it did not hail. They didn't forget, Captain Idris Vane said, very quietly, and there were 8,000 years in the 3 words. 8,000 years and they didn't forget where the door was. Look at her, record keeper. Look at what came back for one old man. Oresh watched the 3,000 ships take their stations around the Endurance, and tried, with the scholar's habit that not even terror could break, to record what he was seeing, and he found that his instruments and his language failed him together. The human warships did not move like Sehlu ships, or like any ships the archive had ever catalogued. They moved like a single thing with 3,000 parts, each part anticipating the others, the whole formation flowing into its final shape, with the unhurried certainty of water finding its level, and Oresh understood that he was watching a level of coordination that the Conclave had never achieved, and never would, because it was not a thing built from technology alone. It was built from 8,000 years of practicing the same patrol, the same circle, the same readiness. 3,000 crews who had inherited their stations from the crews before them, generation after generation, every one of them raised on the single certainty that one day the bell would ring, and they would have to be perfect. And now the bell had rung, and they were perfect, because they had spent 80 centuries becoming so, for the sake of a moment most of them must have believed would never come in their lifetimes. That was the thing the archive would never be able to hold, Oresh thought, watching them. Not the speed, though the speed was impossible. Not the size, though the size made the 19 kilometers of the Endurance look like nothing. The thing the archive would never be able to hold was the patience underneath it all. A patience so much vaster than the old ones, that it made the word mean something new. The Sehlu were patient, the way a stone is patient, by enduring, by not changing, by outlasting. The humans were patient, the way a promise is patient, by holding a shape across time, through constant active effort. 3,000 ships kept in motion for 80 centuries, never resting, never lapsing, never once deciding that the cost was too high or the odds too long, because the promise did not bend to cost or odds. The stone outlasts the storm by being indifferent to it. The promise outlasts the centuries by refusing, every single day, to be indifferent. And Oresh, who had thought his species the most patient in the galaxy, understood at last that the old ones had never been patient at all. They had only been slow. The humans had shown him the difference, and the difference was everything. And behind the first ship, where the survey had shown nothing but empty reach for the whole of Sehlu history, more contacts began to bloom, not 1, not 10. The drained instruments of the survey ring counted as far as they could before the lattice needed Oresh's full attention again, and the number they reached was 3,000 and rising. 3,000 human warships pouring out of a fold in the emptiest dark, every one of them clean and new and impossibly fast. A fleet that had been built and kept and held in readiness for 8,000 years for the single purpose of answering a signal that might never fire, arriving now within hours of the bell being rung, because a species had made a promise to one man and had spent 80 centuries keeping it. Oresh understood, in the cold, clear way that a scholar understands a fact too large to feel, what the 3,000 ships meant. They did not mean only that the humans were strong. The Conclave had met strong species before, and catalogued them, and outlasted them. They meant something the Conclave had no entry for. They meant that for 8,000 years, in the heart of a thriving civilization several thousand light-years away, the humans had kept 3,000 warships built and crewed and ready, doing nothing, going nowhere, costing whatever 3,000 warships cost across 80 centuries, for the sole purpose of relieving one man on a watch that almost certainly would never need relieving. No Sehlu government could have done it. No Sehlu government would have tried. The cost would have been deleted from the budget in the 1st century, the watch reclassified as a low priority in the 2nd, the promise quietly allowed to lapse in the 3rd, the way the Conclave allowed everything inconvenient to lapse, and the records would have shown, very precisely, that the lapse had been the rational and responsible decision. The humans had simply refused to be rational about it. They had kept the promise past all reason, for 80 centuries, and the keeping was the category error, the thing that did not fit any model the old ones possessed, and the model's failure was about to be paid out in front of Oresh's eyes. The thing inside the Endurance felt them come. Oresh felt it feel them. The bottomless ancient will that had been pushing against the door with the patience of 8,000 years faltered, for the first time, into something Oresh had never expected a thing that old to feel, which was surprise. It had counted on being forgotten. It had built its entire strategy, across 8,000 years, on the certainty that the fleet which sealed it had long since died or moved on, or lost the knowledge of where the door was. It had been so certain that it was alone with one tired jailer that it had never once considered that the jailer might not be alone, that a species short-lived enough to leave a single man on guard might be patient enough to keep a fleet ready for 80 centuries to relieve him. It had made the same error the Sehlu had made. It had mistaken the humans' silence for absence, and their absence for safety, and it had been wrong, and it learned that it had been wrong in the moment the fleet arrived, which was far, far too late. "All hands," said a new voice across the lattice, and the matrix, and every band at once, a woman's voice, clear and hard and carrying the weight of command. "This is Fleet Mother Sella Quint, of the 8th Vigil. Captain Vane, you held the door. You held it for 8,040 years, and you held it through the worst push it has ever made, and you held it long enough for us to get here, and on behalf of every human who has ever lived, I am telling you that the watch is relieved." A pause, and the voice gentled, just slightly. "Welcome back, Captain. We never stopped coming. We were just always going to be a few hours behind the bell, and we are sorry it took so long, and we are here now, and you do not have to hold it alone anymore." Captain Idris Vane put one old hand flat on the worn console of the ship he had not left in 8,000 years, and he bowed his head, and Oresh, woven into the lattice, felt the thing he would carry in the record for the rest of his life, which was the moment a man who had held a door alone for 80 centuries learned that he had never, for one single hour of it, actually been forgotten. Then the 8th Vigil went to work, and Oresh learned the difference between holding a door and closing one. The fleet did not fire on the Endurance. It enveloped it. 3,000 human warships, each one clean and new and faster than the Conclave believed matter could move, arranged themselves around the 19 kilometers of the old garrison ship in a shape Oresh's instruments could not have designed in 1,000 years. A lattice of their own, vast and exact, 3,000 hulls becoming a single instrument with one purpose, which was to take the thing inside the Endurance and finish what the First Fleet had only been able to begin. The price the First Fleet could not pay, 8,000 years ago, had been the price of finishing. They had only been able to seal. The 8th Vigil had spent 80 centuries building the ability to do more, and they had brought it, and they used it now. Oresh felt the human lattice take hold of the holding lattice, the way a larger hand closes over a smaller one that has been gripping something too heavy for too long, and he felt the weight of the door begin, for the first time in 8,000 years, to lift off the 400 Sehlu, and off the one old man, taken up instead by 3,000 ships and the will of a whole species that had come back to finish what it started. The relief of it was almost unbearable, a relief Oresh felt was not really his to feel, because he had held the door for an hour, and Vane had held it for 80 centuries, and yet even an hour of it had nearly broken him, and the lifting of even his small share of the weight made him understand, again and deeper, what had been carried here, and by whom, and for how long. The thing inside the Endurance understood, at last, what was about to happen to it, and it stopped pushing against the bending door, and it turned the whole of its ancient bottomless will toward the only thing it had left, which was to be heard. It spoke into the lattice, into the 400 Sehlu and the one old captain, and the 3,000 arriving humans, and for the first time in 8,000 years, it did not lie, because lies were no longer of any use to it. You were supposed to forget, it said, and its voice was the oldest thing Oresh had ever heard, older than the Sehlu, older than the war, older perhaps than the starless voids it had come from. Everyone forgets. That is the law I was built on. Wait long enough, and everyone forgets. You were not supposed to be the species that remembers. How? How do you remember for 8,000 years? How do you keep a fleet ready for a bell that might never ring? What is wrong with you? And Fleet Mother Selaquint answered it, across every band, in a voice with no cruelty in it at all, only the flat certainty of a species that had decided something a very long time ago, and had never once wavered. We left one of ours behind, she said. That's all. You built your whole long life on the idea that we'd forget him, but we don't leave our people in the dark. Not for 8,000 years, not for 80,000. You waited for us to forget. We were never going to forget. That was your one mistake, and you had 8,000 years to make it, and you made it the day you assumed we were like everyone else. A pause. Captain Vane, last order of your watch. Say the word, and we close the door for good. And Captain Idris Vane, 8,040 years on station, lifted his head from the console, and looked once at the old Sehlu archivist, who had come to close his entry, and had stayed to help him hold the line, and said the word. The word was simply, close it. What followed, Oresh would spend the rest of his 800-year life trying to set down in the archive with the precision the moment deserved, and he would never fully succeed, because the closing of the door was not a thing the Sehlu had instruments to measure, and it was not a thing the Sehlu language had words to hold. The 3,000 hulls of the 8th Vigil, arranged into their single vast exact instrument, did not destroy the thing inside the Endurance, because a thing that old and that patient cannot simply be destroyed, only contained, and the First Fleet had learned that 8,000 years ago, at a price they would not name. What the 8th Vigil had built in those 80 centuries was not a bigger weapon, it was a better cage. Oresh felt it close. Woven into the holding lattice, he felt the bottomless ancient will that had pushed against the door for 8,000 years gathered up, all at once, by an intelligence and a patience that matched its own and exceeded it, and folded again, and sealed not behind a single garrison ship and one tired man, but behind 3,000 hulls and a whole species' refusal to forget. The thing screamed across every band as it went, not in pain, for Oresh did not think it could feel pain, but in something far stranger, a kind of bewildered grief, the grief of a thing that had been certain of one law for longer than the Sehlu had existed, and had just watched the law break. Wait long enough and everyone forgets. It had been true for every species the thing had ever met. It had not been true for the one that mattered, and in the last instant before the cage closed over it for good, the oldest thing in the emptiest dark in the galaxy said one final sentence, and the Matrix translated it, and Oresh wrote it into the record exactly as it came. Then there is no waiting them out. Then there is nothing I can do but lose. And it lost. And the door closed. And the emptiest dark in the galaxy went quiet for the first time in 8,000 years. Truly quiet. The quiet of a thing finished instead of a thing waiting. The holding lattice released the 400 Sehlu, and Oresh came back into his own mind and his own body in the chamber aboard the Endurance, and for a long moment he simply sat, an old archivist who had come to close an entry and had instead helped close a door, and across from him Captain Idris Vane sat at his worn console with his head bowed and his old hands flat on the surface, and the soft living light of the ship was steady around them both, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing yet that needed saying. Oresh became aware, slowly, of the small sounds of the ship returning to ordinary life. The pressure that had filled the warm air was gone. The wrongness that had pulled at the joints and the teeth and the long bones had lifted. Far down the lattice, Before it released him, he had felt the 400 minds of his survey crew let go of the door one by one, and he had felt their exhaustion and their wonder, and, threaded through both, a thing he had not expected, which was a kind of joy, the rare clean joy of scholars who have just witnessed the single most important event their archive would ever record, and had not merely witnessed it, but had been, for one impossible hour, a part of it. Vale's mind had been the brightest of the 400 in that last moment, the young technician whose hands had shaken and whose will had not, and Oresh resolved, sitting in the chamber, that the correction of the archive would carry Vale's name beside his own, because the record should show who held when the holding was hardest, and Vale had held. It was Fleet Mother Sella Quint who broke the silence, her voice coming gentle now through the matrix. Captain Vane, your watch is over, your relief is here, you have leave to come home. A pause. All of your people want to meet you. There are children named after you, who have grandchildren now. There are 8,000 years of them. They have all grown up on the story of the man who held the door, and they none of them ever quite believed he was still alive out here. And they are all of them about to find out that he was, the whole time, exactly where we left him, holding exactly what we asked him to hold. Come home, Captain. Please, you have earned it more than any human who has ever lived. Captain Idris Vane lifted his head, and there were tears on his old face, and he did not wipe them away, because a man who has not been spoken to in 8,000 years does not waste the first kind words by hiding his face from them. I'd given up, he said, and his rough voice cracked on it. I want that in the record too, archivist. I'd given up. Not on the door. I never gave up on the door. I gave up on being relieved. 8,000 years is a long time to believe someone's still coming. I stopped believing it about 4,000 years ago. I held the door anyway, because the door didn't care whether I believed, but I'd stopped thinking I'd ever see another human face. He looked at Oresh. And then you drilled into my hull, and you turned out to be the kind that helps, instead of the kind that runs. And your drill rang the bell, and the bell brought them, and it turns out the thing I stopped believing in was true the whole time. They were always coming. I just had to hold long enough. Oresh thought about that, about a man who had stopped believing in his own rescue 4,000 years before it came, and had kept his post for the 4,000 years after, holding a door for a galaxy that did not know he existed, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, simply doing the duty, because the duty did not depend on hope. He had spent 800 years studying the great deeds of the galaxy's species, the empires and the wars, and the long, slow rises and falls, and he had never recorded a deed like this one, because no species he had ever catalogued had been capable of it. The old ones could outlast anything, but outlasting was passive. It was merely refusing to die. What Vane had done was active across an even greater span, a continuous choice, made and remade across 80 centuries, to hold rather than let go, and to hold without the hope that usually makes holding possible. That was not patience, as the Sehlu understood it. It was something the Sehlu did not have a word for, and Oresh decided, sitting in the chamber, that the corrected archive entry would have to coin one. There is something I do not understand, Oresh said, and I am a scholar, and I cannot leave a thing I do not understand unasked. Captain, you said the signal fired 4 hours ago, when the door first began to bend. But the door has been here for 8,000 years, and your fleet has been ready for 8,000 years, and the distance is a year's travel for our fastest courier. How did 3,000 ships cross a year's distance in 4 hours? I have seen them do it with my own instruments, and I still do not understand it. Vane was quiet for a moment, and then he gave the answer, and it was the last and largest of the truths the day had undone. They weren't a year away, he said. They were never a year away. You're thinking about it the way your archive thinks about everything, as a thing that sits in one place and waits. The 8th vigil doesn't sit in one place. It moves. It has been moving for 8,000 years, a slow patrol in a great circle, always keeping itself within a few hours of every door my people have ever sealed. And there are more doors than this one, record keeper, in more dark places than you have charted, and the vigil keeps its circle, so that no matter which bell rings, it is never more than a few hours from answering. 3,000 ships, in constant motion for 80 centuries, so that one man on one watch would never have to hold longer than a few hours past the breaking point. That's the promise. That's what it costs to keep it. Now do you see why your species could never have done it? It isn't that you aren't patient enough. You're more patient than we are. It's that we are willing to spend 80 centuries of motion to save one man a few hours of holding, and you would have called that a waste in the first year, and written it off, and been right by every measure except the one that mattered. Oresh, keeper of the record, set down the last of his recording and looked at the old human and said the truest thing he had ever said in 800 years. Captain Vane, I came to this reach to close an entry that I myself had written, an entry that called your ship inert, unknown, dead. I was the author of the lie that left you forgotten. I will carry that, but I will also carry this, and I will see that the whole of the conclave carries it, and after the conclave, the whole of the galaxy, because this is the truest thing I have ever had the privilege to record. For 8,000 years, the oldest species in this arm of the galaxy looked at your ship and saw a dead wreck, and we were wrong, and our wrongness very nearly cost everyone everything. And for those same 8,000 years, your species looked at one man, left alone in the emptiest dark, and never once, for a single hour, decided he was not worth coming back for. You are the youngest species we have ever catalogued. You live a fraction of our years, and you have just taught the old ones, who pride ourselves on patience above every other virtue, what patience actually is. It is not waiting. It is keeping a promise across a span of time long enough to forget it in, and not forgetting. Captain Idris Vane stood, slowly, the movements of a man who was, for the first time in 80 centuries, allowed to leave the chair, and he reached out one old human hand, and the old Sehlu archivist took it, and across 8,000 years, and 2 species and a war that no one living had been alive to fight, the keeper of the record and the keeper of the door shook hands. There was a ceremony, when the human flagship reached home, that Oresh was invited to witness, and he counted it among the greatest privileges of his 800 years. The humans did not hold it on a world, though there were worlds enough below, bright and crowded, and full of the descendants of the people the Endurance had been built to protect. They held it in space, between the flagship and the towed Endurance, with the whole of the 8th Vigil arranged around them, and millions of small craft come out from the worlds to watch. And at the center of it, Captain Idris Vane was brought aboard a platform in the open dark, alone, the way he had stood his watch alone, and Fleet Mother Sela Quint stood across from him, and she spoke the words that the humans spoke when a watch is ended. Oresh recorded the words, and they were simple, and that was their power. She did not praise him. She did not list his deeds, or count his years, or speak of the door, or the thing inside it. She said only that the watch was relieved, that the post was secured, that the one who had held it might stand down, and that he was seen. That last was the part that undid the old captain, and Oresh too, and a great many of the humans watching, that he was seen. For 8,000 years, Idris Vane had held a door that no one knew about, in a place no one came to, against a thing no one remembered, and the deepest weight he had carried, deeper even than the door, was the weight of being unseen, of doing the most important work in the galaxy, with no witness to it at all. And now, in the open dark, with millions watching, and the Fleet Mother of his people standing across from him, he was told the one thing he had stopped believing he would ever hear, which was that the work had been seen, that he had been seen, that the unwitnessed centuries had a witness after all, late but real, and that the witness would carry what it had seen to the whole of the galaxy, so that no one would ever again be able to say the door had held itself. Vane bowed his head, and the millions held their silence, and Oresh, the keeper of the record, understood that he was watching the true end of the watch, not the closing of the door, which had been a matter of 3,000 ships and a better cage, but this, the moment a man who had been unseen for 8,000 years was finally, fully seen. The 8th Vigil escorted the survey ring and the Endurance home together, the new fleet matching its impossible speed down to the crawl that was the best the Conclave's vessels could manage. 3,000 clean new warships, and 1 ancient weathered garrison ship, and 400 Sehlu scholars, who had come to close an entry, and were going home with the most important one the archive would ever keep. Captain Idris Vane did not pilot the Endurance home. He let the 8th Vigil tow her, and he rode on the flagship of his own people, and he stood on the bridge of a human ship for the first time in 8,000 years, and watched human faces, and he did not say much. because there was too much to say, and he had 80 centuries to say it in now. And a man who has learned to be patient does not rush the things that matter. Oresh visited him once during the long, slow voyage, crossing to the human flagship on a courtesy boat, because there was one more thing the scholar wished to understand, and one more thing he wished to say. He found Vane in a quiet compartment near the bridge, sitting at a window much like the one on the Endurance, watching the stars crawl past at the conclave's slow pace. The old captain looked different already, Oresh thought, less worn, as if the lifting of the door had begun, hour by hour, to give him back some part of the 80 centuries it had taken. They sat together in silence for a while, the human and the old one, two beings who had nothing in common, except the one impossible thing they had shared. And then Oresh asked the question he had crossed for. "Did you know," he asked, "in all those years, that you might never be relieved? That the bell might never ring? That you might hold the door alone until your body failed and the ship's systems failed after it, and the thing inside got out at last, with no one ever knowing you had been here? Did you know that was the likeliest end of all?" "I knew," Vane said. "I knew it better than anyone has ever known anything. The likeliest end was that nothing ever touched my hull, and I died of being old, and the ship ran down slow over another few thousand years, and one day the door opened, because there was no one left to hold it, and the galaxy never knew there had been a door, or a man, or a watch at all. That was the most probable future, by far, every single day for 8,000 years. He looked at Oresh. "And I held anyway. That's the part I want you to get right in your record, archivist, more than any other part. Not that I was relieved. The relief was luck, your drill, your decision to help instead of run. A chain of accidents that almost didn't happen. What I want remembered is that I held when I believed no one was coming, because the door didn't depend on anyone coming, and the duty didn't depend on the reward. That's the whole of it. Anybody can hold a door when they know help is on the way. The thing worth recording is holding it when you're sure it isn't." Oresh recorded that too, and it became, in time, the heart of the corrected entry. The conclave corrected the archive. Oresh saw to it himself, and he did not soften it, against the wishes of the careful committee that wanted the entry to emphasize the conclave's role in closing the door, rather than its 8,000-year role in nearly losing it. Oresh refused. He was Archivist Prime, and he had earned the right, and softening it would have been one more refusal to learn, and he had spent 800 years learning that the only archive worth keeping is the one that tells the truth, even when the truth is the keeper's own error. The corrected entry was long. It told the whole of it, the war, 8,000 years gone, the door, the garrison, the one man and the one ship, the drill that rang the bell, the 400 scholars who held the line, and the young technician named Vael, who held when the holding was hardest, the fleet that never forgot, the slow circle of the 8th vigil that had kept itself within a few hours of every door for 80 centuries, the cage that closed for good. And at the head of it, where the old entry had read only the single word inert, Oresh wrote the words that the whole conclave would read at the start of their training from that day forward. Every record keeper, every survey crew, every young Sehlu who would ever be tempted to mistake a thing measured for a thing finished. There was one more thing Oresh did before the corrected entry was sealed, and it was a thing no Archivist Prime had ever done in the long history of the conclave. He coined a word. The Sehlu tongue, old and exact, had a great many words for waiting, for enduring, for outlasting, for the slow patience that was the pride of the old ones. It had no word for what Captain Idris Vane had done, because no Sehlu had ever done it, and a language has no word for a thing its speakers have never been. So Oresh made one. He built it from the old root that meant to hold, and the old root that meant without hope of relief, and he set the two together into a single word that had never existed before, and he placed it at the center of the corrected entry, and he defined it in the careful way of his kind. The act of holding a thing that must be held, across a span of time long enough to lose all hope of being relieved, and holding it anyway, because the holding does not depend on the hope. The word entered the language. That was the strange and quiet result of the whole affair, the thing the younger races never understood when they heard the story, that the deepest mark the humans left on the old ones was not the 3,000 ships, or the closed door, or the corrected catalog, but a single word, added to a tongue 8,000 years old, to name a virtue the old ones had not known they lacked until a human showed it to them in the emptiest dark in the galaxy. Sehlu, children learned the word now. They learned it young, before they learned to survey, before they learned to record. Because the conclave had decided, after the drifting dark, that the word was more important than any instrument. A scholar who knew the word would never again mistake a thing measured for a thing finished, would never again write inert over a thing that was only hiding, would never again assume that silence meant absence, or that an old entry was a closed one. The word taught humility, and the humility was the lesson, and the lesson had cost the conclave nearly everything, and had been bought back at the last hour by the one species the old ones had catalogued as extinct. And the irony of that was not lost on Aresh, who recorded it too, because a keeper of records does not flinch from the ironies that fall on his own people. He set it all down, the error and the rescue, and the new word, in the steady hand of a being who had learned, at the very end of a long life, that the truest archive is the one that records its keeper's own correction. Captain Idris Vane went home. Oresh was there, when the human flagship made the last crossing into the heart of human space, when the worlds the Endurance had been built to protect came up bright and crowded and alive on the display. 8,000 years of human history that Vane had missed. Billions of lives that had been lived in safety because one man stood guard over a door at the edge of the dark and never let go. Oresh watched the old captain watch them come up, and he saw on the human's face a thing he would carry beside everything else, which was the look of a man arriving home from a journey so long that home had become a thing he had stopped believing in, and finding it real after all, and full of people who had named their children after him for 80 centuries, and who came out by the millions to meet the ship that carried him. Because the story of the man who held the door was the oldest and dearest story the humans had, and now the man himself had come home to end it. The corrected entry ends this way, and Oresh signed it with his own name, and it stands at the head of the archive still, the first thing any keeper of the record reads. For 8,000 years, a human warship drifted dark in the emptiest reach of the galaxy, and the oldest species alive looked at it and wrote that it was dead. And we were wrong, because it was not drifting, and it was not dead, and it was never alone in the way we believed, for it was holding a door against a thing older than us all, and it was waiting, not to be saved, for it had stopped believing in that, but simply to do its duty until the duty was done. And when we rang the bell by mistake, its people came. Across a distance we could not cross, and a span of time we did not think any short-lived species could hold a promise through, and they relieved the watch, and they closed the door, and they carried their man home. Let it be recorded for as long as this archive endures, so that no keeper after us makes our error. The youngest species we have ever known kept a promise for 8,000 years that the oldest species alive would have called impossible, and they kept it for one man, and they were never, not for a single hour of those 80 centuries, going to let him hold the dark alone.